you there?
I'm here.
How you doing?
Great. My first time in Clubhouse.
Woo! Welcome to Clubhouse. Oh, man, we're so excited to have you.
Well, thanks.
I hear you have a drink in your hand?
I do. I better not drink too much of it because I want to give coherent answers.
No, it'll make for a more entertaining conversation. It's totally fine.
No, you're right.
So, Bill, thanks for doing this. I just wanted to have a casual conversation, talk about everything that's going on, everything you've been thinking about. I know you're in the middle of this crazy book tour. We should talk about that too. But I should tell you, when we put this thing up on Twitter, the one thing everybody said to me was, Bill Gates has an iPhone.
I actually use an Android phone, but because I like to keep track of everything, I'm often playing around with iPhones. But the phone I carry around happens to be Android. So
Android versus Apple. Is this a religious thing though?
Well, some of the Android manufacturers pre-install Microsoft software in a way that makes it easy for me, and they're more flexible about how the software connects up with the operating system. So that's what I've ended up getting used to. A lot of my friends have iPhones, so there's no purity.
I know, purity, and I know Paul, you're working hard on an Android version of this, right?
We are. Yeah, we're so excited. Someone asked us the other day what the top feature we're excited to build is, and we said Android. It's so important, right? Especially globally.
So, Bill, have you played around on this thing?
I've had demos, but no, it's just in the last few weeks. It's come up a lot. A friend of mine was just in Steve Jobs Stories Clubhouse yesterday and telling me how much fun that was.
Well, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, that was an amazing room. It was a lot of the original engineers from, the original Apple and Mac team sharing stories about it. That was a great room.
No, I'm sorry I missed it. I could have added a few stories there.
I know. I can't even imagine what that would have added to the conversation.
No, it was an amazing relationship. Steve was so unique.
Well, I want to let you and Andrew speak, Bill, but I just wanted to seriously say how excited and grateful we are to have you be part of this conversation. Like we heard it was going to happen, and the entire team was just so excited about it. I know it's gone beyond that too, and I just want to thank you for everything that you've created, for the new book, for everything that you've added to the world. It's really changed so much of what we do as startup entrepreneurs. So just really, really grateful to be in the room with you today and to have you here.
Great, and I'm learning about Clubhouse, so it's two things at one time.
Well, any questions? We're here to help. So I'll pop back down to the audience, Andrew. But if I can help with anything, just let me know.
Sure. Bill, question though for you about social media. Do you actually personally get to play around on social media a lot yourself?
When people send you links, you end up, clicking through, scrolling through quite a bit. But I tend to go to, The Economist, the New York Times, pretty directly to my favorite news sources, more than people who just are using a feed to find the stories they read.
You don't have a burner Twitter account?
Well, I have a Twitter account that I just mess around on, and then I have my official Twitter account. That's true on most of the services, that there's the official me, and then there's the messing around me.
Are you ever a TikTok guy? I mean, the reason I'm asking is I'm curious if you see, obviously right now everybody is fascinated about Clubhouse and the future of Clubhouse and what it's going to do, and Twitter's trying to do one, and Facebook's trying to do one. But I was curious if you feel like you've seen over the years, that you caught on early to that Facebook was going to be a big thing, or that TikTok was going to be a big thing.
No, I'll give my daughter more credit on TikTok. I didn't realize that there was such an unmet demand for watching people dance. But then, there was the whole divestment thing that Microsoft was at least looking at that. So I got very up to speed. As part of that, I even did a few goofy videos.
I got to go watch those.
One thing that I have to mention is in the very first version of Clubhouse, my co-founder Rohan and I, Rohan sitting in the front row here, the whole app was a single room, and everyone followed everyone, and everyone was a speaker. And we had a little alert set up every time a new person would join, because we always wanted to make sure that the conversation got started. So I would be on the phone with Rohan. We'd be working, and I'd hear like a little alert sound, and I'd hang up. I'd be like, gotta go. And I'd hang up, and I'd jump into the room and say, hey, how's it going? I'm Paul. How'd you hear about Clubhouse? And I always compare myself to Clippy. Just being there waiting for people, seeing if I could help.
So Bill, you've been in the middle of this crazy book tour. We've seen you all over 60 Minutes, everywhere. Before we even get into the book and what's going on with climate, and I want to talk pandemic and so many other things, do you actually enjoy these book tours, and especially this one in particular, because it's all virtual? I'm just curious how it's going.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I don't have to fly. I do at most 2 a day. Some are fairly specialized, like Columbia or Stanford, or groups of experts who work like a Sarah conference type thing. But the nine are just sort of city-based. We get different questions, and I pick people I enjoy talking to. Trevor Noah did one. Rashida Jones. I just did one with Christian Walker, which was great. So they managed to bring their own touch to it. I'm sure a couple weeks from now I'll be ready to move on.
And do you read all the reviews of the book?
I do, and so far I'm very happy. In fact, we just hit today the number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list.
Congratulations. It's a big congratulations. Generally, by the way, do you feel like you have thick skin, though? I've always actually been curious about this. We've never talked about this, because you're written about constantly. I mean, virtually every day in one context or another.
Well, climate, you better have thick skin, because the amount of oversimplification and misunderstanding is pretty broad in the field. It's a field that's so important, but I'd call it at an early stage. And you almost have to be polymathic to understand it, because there's science, there's economics, there's these models, there's weather. And, I try, not to get frustrated if people are, like saying it can be solved in 10 years or saying that it doesn't matter at all. I have to steel myself up for that, so that I'm giving a persuasive answer as opposed to an emotional response.
Okay, so I want to go deep on some climate stuff, if we could. And I've read the book now, I think twice, and we've talked a little bit about it ourselves. You and I think 2 or 3 times now before this conversation. And I wanted to talk a little bit about nuclear energy, because you go deep and hard on that issue. But you also go deep at the issue that we spend a little bit too much time these days, and we're too obsessed with the ideas of EVs, for example, electric vehicles, and that we need to spend more time thinking about things that most people don't spend time thinking about, which is things like, cement and steel and farming. And so I was hoping you could sort of prioritize how you think the public should actually think about these issues.
Well, a key point of the book is there are a lot of emissions, 51 billion tons a year, and the goal to stop the temperature rise is to get that to zero. And if we can do that by 2050, then we limit the amount of damage that gets done. Understanding all those sources, because zero doesn't allow you to skip any. If it was 50%, you would skip the harder ones. And unfortunately, because we've mostly paid attention to near-term reductions, so we're putting most of our effort into the rollout of wind and solar and electric cars, which are phenomenal. I'm to prove that in some cases we can get the scale up and get the extra cost, which I call the green premium, down, that gives us hope. It gives us a model for all the other areas. But we are deeply invested in areas like cement and steel that are way more emissions between those than all the passenger cars in the world.
So on cement and steel, how far are we away? I mean, it
we
feels like
basically
we're really
haven't
far away.
started. We basically haven't started. The Breakthrough Energy event got going in 2015. My commitment to the heads of state who did the event with me, where they committed to double the energy R&D. I committed to them to create a venture group that was totally specialized with a very deep business and scientific team, just investing in big climate impact things. And so we've invested now in all the different areas. We found more in storage and in food than we expected. So our second fund, the second billion we just started, will push super hard to find more in the industrial areas and direct air capture, including what's called green hydrogen, that if it got cheap enough, would help solve a number of the industrial processes.
Okay, so let's talk about, you used a different phrase. I was going to call it carbon capture. You just said something else. How far are we away from that for real?
Well, there's a company called Climeworks that if you pay about $600 a ton, they will take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, liquefy it, put it down in a mineral formation where it'll stay for millions of years. And so to get rid of my own personal offsets, one of the things I did was pay them. I also pay for green aviation fuel so that when I'm flying, it's not, there's no net emissions. I'm using solar panels. I have electric cars now. So direct air capture exists. And I've invested in a lot of companies that are working in that area. We want to get the cost down at least to $100 a ton. But even that would be too expensive for most things. Elon Musk put out a challenge recently, which was great, to say, okay, who thinks they can get to the lowest price here? And a number of the companies I'm working with are going to try and win that prize.
Did you just say you're an electric car owner?
Yeah, I own. It's kind of not an everyman's car. It's called a Porsche Turbo Taycan, but it's fun.
Okay, so why Porsche and not Tesla? Everyone's probably gonna pick up on this.
No, Tesla's a fantastic car. I've bought Teslas for relatives. My very first car was a Porsche. It makes a certain sound. Tesla's the company that's done the most for electric cars, done a brilliant job is Tesla.
Okay, one more Tesla question. How far ahead do you think Tesla really is? Meaning, do you part of the argument about its valuation, about so much of Tesla right now, is that its battery technology and everything else is just leap years ahead of everybody else, and that when GM and Audi and Volkswagen and everybody else and BMW and Toyota get there, they're still going to be behind. You buy that?
Well, for the key components, there are people like QuantumScape that, although they're not shipping yet, they've got a strong valuation because they have a better battery. Panasonic, continues to improve, continues to supply lots of people. So I don't think there'll be only one electric car company. I was very impressed that GM said that by 2035 they're going to stop making gasoline cars. So the amount of creativity by all the car companies going into this, partly because Tesla has shown that the market is there, it is phenomenal. That category, what I call the green premium, will go to zero because the upfront costs will go down. There'll be more charging stations. There'll be quick charging. And so the idea that you no longer make gasoline cars, that, people don't rebel when politicians or CEOs say that's coming.
So you're personally offsetting your own carbon use. You're spending something on the order of, I think, $7 million a year to do that?
That's right, which I don't pretend that kind of brute force approach works for everybody, but I have found truly gold standard permanent emission reduction, so that I am helping to bootstrap those technologies, become a customer, and get the price down. And even going through that process to zero out my emissions showed me how immature some areas like green aviation fuel are. I'm now by far their biggest individual customer, and I've gotten them to go to more airports than they were in before.
So what do you make of all these companies that are buying carbon offsets? Typically, they're effectively saying they're protecting or protecting forests and trees and the like. Is that real to you, or is that carbon offset theater?
It's fantastic that companies are buying offsets. If you go back 5 years ago, almost nobody was doing that. Now, some of these offsets are high impact and some of them are very low impact. And so as we work that through, the overall quality of offsets will go up. But the companies that are buying offsets are to be congratulated for caring about this cause and putting significant money into those offsets. It's up to the innovators now. We're going to get offsets to a variety of those out there, and we're going to do a better job of certifying. There's a few places you plant trees where they'll last a long time. There's other places where they won't. We need to mature the how we rate the quality of those offsets. But I love the companies that are writing checks and buying offsets.
So separately, you've gone big in terms of investing in nuclear energy, and it's a controversial thing to have done. And at the same time, we've had conversations about wind and solar and how quickly you think that can ramp relative to everything else. There's a big debate about that, which is to say, where should the U.S. government and governments around the world be invested? And politically, being invested in nuclear has not been a palatable solution thus far. What do you think about that?
Well, nuclear energy has provided an immense amount of green energy, and the health benefits of using nuclear versus, say, burning coal are super dramatic. Even if you account for the few accidents, it's by far the safest thing. However, I wouldn't say that today's generation of nuclear reactors, it has a path forward. They are just too complex and way too expensive. And because their safety relies on operators to do the right things, they're reactors with very high pressure inside the reactor, we need a complete from scratch generation of reactors that people call fourth generation, that there's no high pressure, that it's the physics alone that says that the radioactive material won't leave the site area. And it means, using metal sodium for the cooling instead of water. Water boils and gets very high pressure and wants to leave the site, whereas a sodium pool, none of the afterheat can cause a problem because of that heat capacity. So nuclear needs innovation because economics are what really killed nuclear. Once we get this demo plant done, which will take 5 years, it's half funded by the company, which I guarantee, and half by the U.S. government, then people will see, okay, how does it look for safety? How does it look for cost? And then we'll have the hard challenge of saying to people, yes, this nuclear is super important to reliability of the grid, to let us decarbonize the grid. And so please have an open mind as you study this particular breakthrough.
So, but how fast do you think that can happen realistically relative to, and this is the other issue, wind and solar?
Well, wind and solar are today 6% of U.S. generation and less than that on a global basis. And let's say you're going to have the renewables carry 80% of the load, which I think is realistic. If we build enough transmission, we get some advances in storage, and we have the final 20% be always available, non-weather dependent green, which means nuclear fission, until someday fusion comes along. And to get to that 80% implies a build rate over 3 times the peak of what we've achieved so far. And so, you could say I'm the biggest proponent of roll that stuff out. Now you've got to connect it up. We want to bring offshore wind into the mix because that's near to the East Coast where we use a lot of our power, and that won't tend to be down at the same time as the Midwest wind is down, so it helps the reliability equation quite a bit. So, 80% is kind of mind-blowing. We're not yet on a path to get that type of penetration.
So, okay, different question. Green New Deal. You believe it? You buy into it or no?
Well, I like green, I like new, I like deal, but if someone thinks we can solve the climate emissions in the United States in 10 years, I need to see that plan. It's just not realistic. And remember, this is not just about brute force getting rid of U.S. emissions. That's less than 15%. This is about using the innovation power of the United States to reduce the green premiums for all areas of emissions. And so that even countries like India, who needs basic shelter, basic electricity because they are going to require air conditioning, they in 2050 will look and see if this stuff is super expensive and we're not willing to subsidize the trillions that it would cost at this point. They're going to keep doing it anyway and say that, hey, it's up to the rich world to deal with this problem, although they're very much on the front lines. And so the overall extra cost, which is the total green premium, which is over $5 trillion right now, we need to bring that down by about 95%. And the U.S. has over half of the innovation power that will allow us to do that. Europe needs to be part of it. China needs to be part of it. India needs to be part of it. But it's kind of a global problem, and it's way, way, way too expensive to be green, particularly in manufacturing categories.
So, Bill, I just discovered while we've been having this conversation that we happen to be competing against another room called, and only on Clubhouse would this be the case, climate and Bitcoin, the favorite topics here on Clubhouse. Bitcoin seems to always get into every conversation. What do you make of the whole, let's take the Bitcoin price out of it for a second. What do you make of the climate argument around Bitcoin?
Well, Bitcoin uses more electricity per transaction than any other method known to mankind. And so, it's not a great climate thing. Now, if it's green electricity and it's not crowding out other uses, eventually, maybe that's okay. So I don't see the topics as deeply related, even though you might label me a Bitcoin skeptic. That is, I haven't chosen to invest money. I buy malaria vaccines. I buy measles vaccines. I invest in companies that make products. It's not hey, somebody's going to buy this for more money than I pay for it. But, if other people find their fortune that way, I applaud them.
But you don't think, and there are people who believe this. I'm sticking with the climate thing on Bitcoin for a second. There are people who believe, and these are Bitcoin bears, that given the energy requirements to create and maintain the Bitcoin network, that actually ultimately, given all of the societal efforts for climate, that actually regulators or rules would be imposed or make it more expensive to actually hold Bitcoin.
No, I should look at the most bullish projection on what percentage of the electricity demand it would be. There are other ways of doing digital currency that our foundation is involved with, which are done in local currency. The transactions are not secret. They're reversible. You can't use it for ransom or things like that. And yet the transaction fees are so low that it's empowering the poorest. So, we worked with India to do their digital currency. We're working with all the countries in Africa. So I'm a huge fan, the biggest investor philanthropically in digital currency so that financial services are available to everyone on the planet.
And you've invested a ton, but by the way, what we haven't talked about is batteries. You've invested a ton in batteries and frankly lost a ton in batteries. Why?
Well, if if you fund enough battery companies, you can take a large fortune to make a small fortune. So, look, it's a hard area. And when we say batteries, remember there's two markets for batteries that their requirements are utterly different. One is a battery for an electric car, where the weight and the size and the not having a problem when you have a crash are key parameters. Then there's grid batteries. Grid batteries are over 20 times harder, and that's companies like Form Energy, which is an investment of Breakthrough Energy. Very exciting because they started over with very cheap elements, and they said, okay, we can give up some efficiency if we're super, super, super cheap. And of course, you don't have to use a battery to store energy. You could use a heat store, like a company called Malta that Breakthrough Energy helped spin out of Google. There's unusual ways of storing energy, like QuidNet wants to pressurize water underground and have that pressure come back, almost like, pumping water uphill, but here you can do it almost anywhere. So if you take storage broadly, yes, I'm by far the biggest investor in all these different storage approaches, because that's got to be an element of having this gigantic green grid. For example, when Tokyo gets a typhoon, wind and solar would be off for 7 days, and yet, that's a challenge. You don't want people to freeze there like they have been in Texas.
Talking about, I wasn't going to just talk about Texas, but let's talk actually about food and farming. I was just reading, you happen to be the largest farm owner in the country now?
Yeah, don't think I personally went around. It's not a Green Acres type story. My investment team buys a broad set of assets, and a number of small farms, big farms have gotten into that portfolio. But that's my delegation to them, and so it's a significant asset.
Okay, but now Bill Gates is a farmer. So how do you think about that? What do you do with all the cows?
I'm not sure how many cows we have, but whatever product category you're in, you face competition. So if people can make artificial meat that tastes as good and costs less, even ignoring animal cruelty and some of the health benefits and the greenhouse gas benefits, that's just a form of competition. I don't know if that can happen, but so far, Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, and several others like Nature's Find are doing food production in novel ways. And so that, could just be an overall helpful thing in terms of bringing the cost of food down. In terms of farming in general, we're likely to use some amount of biofuels, and so that's an additional demand. Probably not ethanol, because that ended up having fairly high emissions, although there was a lot of it that was made. But I don't think farming in general is a bad business to be in.
I want to pivot in a sec to talk pandemic with you and just the future of the world and how you're thinking about so many other things. But for me, this book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, was an education. But I heard for you, the book that was your education was Weather for Dummies. I wanted to understand why that was. What happened?
Well, I read a lot of books. I highly recommend Weather for Dummies. I highly recommend Václav Smil, whose best book is Energy and Civilization. The Dummies books, it's an ironic thing. They do a very good job reminding us why clouds gather, what the types of clouds are, why it rains around mountains. And that, as I was coming to look at all these dynamics, before I ask dumb questions of the experts, I want to have grounding. So, it's very well written.
Okay, so let's pivot, if we could, for a little bit talk about the pandemic, because you were early on this. You were very early on this, warning us all about it, and you've been involved in it in a very intense way. And I think hopefully there are people on this call that have gotten the vaccine, and a lot of people waiting desperately to get the vaccine. You've gotten the first shot, right?
I have had my second shot actually a week ago.
You had your second. Congratulations.
Yeah, it's the only time I've ever been thankful to be such an old person, 65 years old.
Okay, so you have your second shot. Okay, so now this gets interesting. So I hope you've now started to look at a calendar. And you always, to me, were always almost overscheduled in terms of all the things you had to do. When are you going to start moving around again the way you used to?
Well, I want to set a good example. If you're vaccinated, you can still transmit. It's not as likely, but unlike severe disease that becomes extremely rare, you still have a possibility of transmission. So, I'm not going to stop wearing masks or, be careful, particularly around older people who haven't been vaccinated. And, of course, I'm with my family a lot who, they're young enough that they're not yet vaccinated. So, it's only by late spring or summer that we're going to get to numbers where you can look at changing your behavior in a significant way.
Okay, so but help us. If you were looking at a calendar now and you had to talk to your assistant and say, okay, we on this date is when we're going to start thinking about whether we make a trip here, whether we go here, whether we start having meetings. What day or month does that look like for Bill Gates?
Well, an important issue is getting the vaccine not just to the rich countries, but to all countries, and that's a huge role that the investments and efforts of the Gates Foundation have involved in. We've, started up factories in India that are very high volume, and so global travel you'll have to be careful till sometime in 2022 because of this inequity that the vaccines aren't getting out there. In the U.S., the supply situation is getting good. The logistics are okay. We still don't know if the demand, that is the trust that people want to take the vaccine, including in people of color who have some skepticism about the health system. We need to get very high levels of vaccination before the transmission levels will drop to near zero. But I'm hopeful we'll get there, and I'd say domestically in the U.S., people will be able to do more, still wearing masks, in the right situations and still not, big full stadiums. But by summer, things will feel very different. In schools in the fall, I would expect that basically all schools will be open.
Okay, but I have small kids. I think, and I don't know, I'm curious what you think. I think they're going to be in school in the fall. They're in school now, actually, wearing masks. But I think they'll be in school in the fall wearing masks again, or not.
Well, wearing masks isn't some huge, disastrous thing. There's some places where when I play tennis, they have me wear a mask and I pocket my glasses, but, even that's not a big deal. So, it's not expensive. We're kind of used to it. I would continue to model that behavior throughout the fall until we're absolutely sure the numbers are very, very small.
And how much do you worry, though, about potentially either the South African variant spreading or the fall and winter being tougher? I had a conversation with Dr. Scott Gottlieb the other day, who was saying, we might have a nice spring and summer, but it might get more complicated again.
Well, he's absolutely right that this is a seasonal disease, and that'll be the test. Is there a fall wave? I don't think there will be, but it depends on getting those vaccination levels up and helping the other countries so we're not having constant reintroductions. Your point about the variant's a very good one. Our foundation was funding studies in South Africa as that variant appeared. Now, we didn't know that would happen. We funded those studies so that there was some safety data from the continent of Africa and so that we could do studies that included people living with HIV. But it ended up informing the world for 3 of the vaccines, AstraZeneca, Novavax, and Johnson & Johnson, how the effectiveness was against that variant. And, it did reduce the Johnson & Johnson and Novavax by much, AstraZeneca a little more. So the fact we had that trial there was very helpful to say, okay, do we need to tune the vaccine, which, might mean a third dose for people already vaccinated. And the companies are hard at work looking at that. And do they need to do multiple varieties? How do we cover the full set of variants that are showing up in the world? Fortunately, most they have common features. And so this isn't like a disease where you'll need a 10-valent vaccine with 10 different forms. At most, it'll be 2 or 3.
Do you think warp speed worked in the U.S.? And one of the reasons I asked the question is because what you're seeing happening in Britain, at least, it looks like they're really moving ahead of us, in part because they approved the AstraZeneca drug, which I know was something that you were supporting.
Well, the reason the U.S., it was actually BARDA, then it got renamed that funny name, but BARDA funded 4 of the 5 gold standard vaccines. Pfizer chose not to take government money, so they did the deal with BioNTech and funded it themselves. But the next 4, including Moderna and the 3 I already mentioned, if it wasn't for that BARDA generosity, those things wouldn't have moved as quickly as they did. The next biggest funder was a thing our foundation is part of called CEPI. But even in total, CEPI was less than half of the BARDA checks that went out. So the one thing the U.S. gets a good grade on in this whole pandemic, the only thing was funding the R&D for those vaccines. And, that was a huge contribution for the world.
And so, on a relative basis, actually, let me ask you this. Countries is there any country out there that would surprise us about how well they're doing with this, in your mind?
Well, Australia, Vietnam, New Zealand, every country's doing something right. But those 3 caught the disease early instead of having the idiocy of doing the travel ban and then not testing the people who came in.
So, I guess the big next question, beyond trying to figure out what next winter is going to be like, is what do we need to do to avoid the next disaster? And what do you think that could even be or look like? How often do you think this is going to happen to us?
I think if you put aside intentionally caused epidemics, bioterrorism, the risk per year is like 2 or 3%. And so even at that level, though, doing the right things, spending tens of billions to avoid the trillions of dollars in damage and all sorts of damage that doesn't even get into that economic figure of mental challenges and education loss, that insurance policy is a very good deal. Now, the thing that Gates Foundation will do is make sure that those tens of billions are actually not just beneficial to the next pandemic, but you create a standby force that's working on things like malaria and measles normally and keeping their skills sharp. And if there's any hint of a pandemic, which we'll build a 100 times better surveillance system, including high-skill diagnostics, those, say, 3,000 disease fighters will drop the current infectious disease work they're doing and just totally be the brilliant people to make sure the quick epidemic response happens on a global basis. So I'm actually pretty excited that those investments in the R&D side, things like getting mRNA to be cheap, which it's not yet, getting factories all over the world, getting a new way of doing the diagnostics that's PCR, so very, very accurate, but also very cheap. The innovation during the crisis was strong, and that's a foundation that will advance not only global health and infectious disease, but that BioNTech vaccine platform. Actually, the main reason they made it was to go against cancer. Our foundation invested in that company to make sure they'd have money to do infectious disease also. But this is pretty profound advance, 10 years of progress in less than 2 years.
Okay, putting the science and innovation part aside for a second, I have a behavioral science question for you, which is, do you think that the world, or let's just take the United States, learned a lesson in this so that we're actually going to be better off next time? I'm not talking about the science of whether we can get a vaccine. I'm talking about whether you think when something like this happens, people are going to take seriously the real risk. They're going to actually listen to experts. Or do you think that the whole idea of expertise and science has been upended during this period?
Well, I think the quality of leadership you have during a crisis matters. If a leader is willing to share the bad news, if the leader is really getting the data out, encouraging more testing to be done, not having a testing system where you don't get your results within 24 hours. I mean, the number of mistakes were pretty unbelievable. We were lucky this thing wasn't more fatal than it ended up being. But it's still, 500,000 Americans, that's an unbelievable toll. And of course, the global toll is much higher than that. I do think that for at least a generation, people will have this threat model in mind, and that the government will take the right steps, even though, maybe 10 or 20% of the people will never believe it. Apparently that's true for the election also. But, this is serious stuff. Most people know somebody who died.
Is there a leader that you think actually did a good job in this? And I'll throw a leader out. I'm in New York right now, and it's also got an upended, which is a lot of people looked at Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York and thought that actually, putting aside what happened in the first month and a half, that he actually had done a very good job of being what people thought was transparent. And now there's questions about, frankly, whether he was being that transparent at all.
Yeah, he called me during the pandemic because there were various models that gave him such a range of how many ventilators he might need. And I would say, on a Saturday night, I got to talk to him about that. He was clearly forthright, but some of the policies about putting the numbers out and transferring people into homes where they might have caused infection, we'll be digging through what mistakes were made and what was done well for a long time here. In his case, there's some definite very positive things he did, but, now we're looking at the whole way that the numbers got reported. If you want a pure example, you'd say, the leadership in New Zealand, in Australia, in Vietnam, countries that had a little bit of either SARS or MERS and understood that you have to get the commercial PCR machines, and anyone who comes into the country, you don't just do a travel ban and force a surge of infection into the country without the testing. I mean, that's so basic. And to brag about that as though it was a smart thing, that's really wild.
Well, let's hope there's not another pandemic in the end. A couple personal questions before we end this. Tell us just about how what is the day in the life of Bill Gates actually in the pandemic?
It's a lot of Microsoft Teams, a lot of Zoom. I can schedule myself without any time between meetings, so I have to be a little careful there. Maybe get up and stretch.
But are you at home? Do you go to the office? What time do you wake up? Is there a gym? Is there not a gym? Are there people that you would have seen in the past that you're now not seeing? Are there people inside your house that you don't have? How has it changed? I mean, I know some people have gotten rid of everybody. Other people have. How's it work for you?
Well, I feel lucky that I have a home with a very good internet connection. So actually, my kids, senior in high school, a junior in college, and a second-year medical student, I've seen them more this year than I would have expected because they were home a lot doing their courses online. So it's mostly just our family. I get outside to play pickleball even in the cold weather. That's been super nice. Not having to make any international trips is a huge change to my schedule because, I go to Africa, China, India, Europe, all several times a year. And it's amazing. I can talk to African leaders and do like a 20-minute video connection, get a lot done. So there are certain advantages, even though, the whole thing is a tragedy.
Okay, let's talk TV because I know you watch a lot of TV. Well, we could talk books too, but TV binging during the pandemic for you. Anything you want to recommend to this audience?
Well, I sat down Monday to eat dinner, and I was going to finish reading a book called War Story, but instead I clicked on this Lupin, which is a French burglar on Netflix. Next thing I knew, 4 hours had gone by. So I really let myself go to seed that night. And I was kind of laughing at myself that I don't usually do that. But wow, they sure make it easy. You just sit there and the next episode is up and running.
Anything else on your TV list? We've had a whole year. By the way, do you think the content's gotten better or worse during this year? Because I feel like I've sort of run through a lot of stuff. Some stuff is starting to come back. That's okay.
Well, there's so much stuff that you worry there's good stuff that you're missing. The quality overall, if you compare to say 10 years ago, it's mind-blowing how good this stuff is. The complex plots, the choices, even just in the documentary area, it's quite phenomenal. I have a strange taste that I take a lot of college courses, which is on a channel called The Great Courses. That's about, a third of my viewing, where it's right now I'm taking a course on the Old Testament, which is definitely fascinating. But wow, if you want to learn stuff, this is the era that it's all there.
So when you're taking these courses, watching this stuff, and your kids come in the room, are they like, Dad, what are you doing? Why aren't you watching something on Netflix, or do they sit down and actually watch with you?
Not much. I mean, my son and I watched The Americans together. That was a fun experience. It was a little too violent for the rest of the family. Modern Family, we all watched together, although that's not recent. It's nice that once you get going on something, kind of the whole family does it together. But my courses, those I'm pretty much solo on those.
And are you a gamer, by the way? Microsoft obviously is in the game business.
No, I play bridge, which by some definitions is a game, but it doesn't require a video game. I've got the latest Xbox. I played around with it some, but I'm not a heavy gamer. I sit and watch my nieces and nephews. I learn more from them than my own personal use.
By the way, we were talking about social networks at the top of this because we were talking about Clubhouse. Did you ever fund any social networks yourself early on?
Well, Microsoft and MSN had, the same kind of chat forums that other people did. And, of course, Microsoft owned shares in Facebook because we were doing some things where we were looking at search and Facebook working together. But, no, LinkedIn, of course, now is part of Microsoft, and that's doing extremely well.
Okay, serious question, and I'm getting it on Twitter. Do you use Google or do you use Bing?
I use Bing.
You do?
Of course. I look at Google to compare to see how we're doing competitively, and I'm always happy with them. But I'm a loyal Bing user.
You're a loyal Bing user. Okay, this is interesting because I have to admit, don't hate me for saying this, I don't know a lot of people using Bing.
Well, you travel with a very snobby crowd.
It may very well be a snobby crowd.
Absolutely. You've got to come down here and get with the masses and use Bing.
So, tell me before you go. Tell us what are you doing these days with Microsoft itself? By the way,
Satya makes it a lot of fun for me to do product reviews. So often stuff that's we're planning the next year or 2 years of things, the really high reach stuff. I do a lot with the agent. I'm a big believer that agents are going to be 100 times better than they are today, and that I want Microsoft to lead in that. I do a lot with Office, with AI, with Azure. I love the product reviews. So Satya's got me now where I'm doing the part of the job that I enjoyed the most, and there's enough good work that I can provide a lot of encouragement, some hints about how to do things differently. So I spend, it'd be 2 or 3 days a month, although the pandemic's reduced that somewhat. I'll catch up, I hope, this summer.
If you take Microsoft out of it, who right now do you think is doing the most interesting work in terms of agents, AI, and really, futuristic stuff?
Well, Google and Microsoft are the two hardcore R&D companies. Yes, Amazon's doing great work, Apple's doing great work, Facebook, but in terms of really pushing the boundaries of computer science and architecture and AI, I'd say Google and Microsoft have that strong R&D commitment, both stuff that they share openly and things that they do that focus on their own products. So it's incredible. I dreamed of having R&D budgets like Satya has today. So if I can help him steer it a little bit better, it's potentially high impact and certainly a lot of fun for me.
What do you think of the idea of like an Apple making a car?
I doubt they'll make the same margin they make on the iPhone. Autonomous cars is still how quickly that catches on, and do people own cars? That's unclear. Electric cars, that's clear. Over the next 20 years, dramatic shift. Autonomous is still the one where which countries it catches on first, how safe is it? That's open. So, even though Google got in there with way more early, maybe Apple can make a contribution there. Usually you do products, you don't want to be the 100th one to do a product. So you've got to have kind of a unique take on a product if you want to get Apple-like margins.
Is there a piece of tech in your life right now that you use that's new or cool or different? I was asked this question the other day, and my answer was I'm wearing an Oura ring. I don't know if you know what that is. It's this.
I wear my Oura ring every night. I check my REM sleep. I sometimes fall short. I try and think, hey, did I snack too late? No, I'm addicted to Aura's feedback.
How are your numbers? I'm on a
not too good. It often says to me, it says to me in the morning, it will be okay. And I always know that's a bad sign.
That is a bad sign. Mine says go easy. That's what I got today. Go easy. So I don't know. I want to thank you for this conversation, Bill, and to tell you to go easy. We appreciate you joining us. This was a ball. I hope we have an opportunity to do this again. Frankly, I hope we have the opportunity to do this in person sometime soon when the world does go back to normal. But thank you, and thanks everybody for joining. This was a lot of fun, and if you do have a chance, and I will push it for you, Bill, because I enjoyed the book. I know you've become a book influencer. Somebody actually just sent me a text saying they're buying Weather for Dummies, but Bill's book is called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. So thanks again.
Thanks. That was great.
See you guys. And Paul, thank you for making this all happen and hooking it up.